So it might be useful here for us to reframe a definition of the self. So this would be a reframing of the definition of the self. And this reframing of the definition of the self begins to give us some tools. Because all problems begin with the assumptions that we have. If we keep our assumptions and try to solve the problem, it's not going to happen. So we have to examine basic, fundamental assumptions. So let's begin with some assumptions about the self. I'm no longer saying there is no self because I just got too much flat. We're not going to say that. What we're going to say is that we're interested in inquiring into the nature of the self. Now, you're not resistant to that, are you? Because no one wants to be the hole in the middle of the donut. So what we're talking now about is examining the nature of the self. So the way we do it currently is that the self is a thing. Self is a thing, and anything that's a thing is solid, it's fixed, and it's permanent. So we live our life as though we were a solid, fixed, permanent thing. Now the problem with that is that anything that's a thing has mass and it has gravity. All things, all material things, and we deal with ourself as though it's a thing, has mass and it has gravity. So the more of a thing we make of ourselves, which happens on occasion, because once we make a thing of something out there, we make a thing of everything, including ourselves. Then the self becomes like a black hole. The black hole of the self. And the black hole of the self absorbs energy, absorbs light, has tremendous mass, gravity, significance, and importance. Sometimes we think that way, right? Sometimes it happens. When we do that, what happens is we have two ways of perceiving. We have what I think of that, my opinion of that, how I feel about that. So there's an I that's making a commentary about what it perceives without recognizing that what it perceives is a function of how it looks at it. We don't do that. We think that we're perceiving things not as a function of how we're interpreting it. We think we're seeing it how it really is. And then we have an opinion and a judgment about what we just perceived and interpreted. So there's the outward of the I, the subjective I. And then there's the objective me. It's a very narrow channel that we're tuned in on. So it's what I think of that, what I perceive of that, and how that is affecting me. So there's an I and a me that naturally, this is just natural, this is how it is. There's an I and a me in all perception that occurs with the gravity of the solid, separate self. That makes sense? So once the self becomes solid, once the self becomes permanent, once the self becomes a thing, then it has gravity and it takes possession of all of its experiences. And we live in a rather egocentric world. We live the reality, we live the truth I have to watch that language. We live the truth of that egocentricity. Now, without being judgmental and without being critical and without whipping ourselves and without saying, oh, I've done it again, I just have to stop doing it. We can just notice it. Let's be gentle, let's be playful, let's be kind. Let's notice certain tendencies of mind. It's not being a horrible, terrible, selfish, awful person at all. Although sometimes we can think that way, and that's also a pattern of mind. Instead of thinking of the self as a thing that's solid, fixed, and permanent. Now here's the reframe. We could consider the possibility that self is an opening. That self is an opening through which flows the light of knowing. That self is an opening through which flows an active, knowing tendency that illuminates and structures all that is known. So now, instead of self being a dense, self-absorbed, solid thing, self becomes an opening. And it's an opening through which an active, knowing awareness flows. And that active, knowing awareness illuminates and structures all that's known. Now we have a little bit of leverage here. Now we've got a little bit of space. If self is an opening, or a lens, or a space, through which an active knowing awareness flows, then we can begin to dilate the space through which knowing occurs. So it would begin, for example, where the self, instead of being a solid, dense thing, becomes more translucent. We could work with translucence. That knowing passes through a translucency. Or we could develop a way where self becomes transparent and an active, knowing presence presents and illuminates all that is perceived, all that is known. Or we could work with either transparentizing or making more translucent the density and solidity of the self. We could work with opening, dilating the self. More open settings allow more space, more clarity, more degrees of freedom, more options, more possibilities. The narrow, reactive self setting, we talk about self settings. So now we're working with something that's more dynamic, something that we can begin to regulate. So if we're talking about self settings, then we can recognize that a particular setting is in play when I'm irritated, annoyed, impatient, resentful, reactive. And it really, truly is that way with that self setting. That's true. Now, is it real? Now, real means it could be no other way. Well, it's true, but it's not real. So if it's not real, then it could be another way. So how could it be another way? So it could be another way if the self can become more translucent or transparent. Or if the self could dilate, relax, open, allowing more light, more knowledge, more freedom, more ease, then it could be another way. And in that way, considering it that way, what we want to do is we want to understand, we want to know another way so that we can be another way. That's where this line of reasoning came. How to know another way in order to be another way. Another way to know is the self is an opening. It's an opening that allows an active, knowing awareness. And that the active, knowing awareness structures and illuminates all that is known.